Hey guys, welcome back. This is another bonus segment, and this is a fairly lengthy discussion that my friend Asaid and I were having about how to use flashcards properly and the appropriate settings for Anki, and kind of how we think about building, almost like building a second brain using Anki as your flashcard app. The advice in here can apply to any sort of flashcard app, but to be honest, Anki is the most famous one. It's the best one. It's open source. It's free, except on iOS where you have to pay 20 quid for it. It's totally worth it. So yeah, this is the discussion between me and Asaid about how to use Anki properly. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you at the end.
Anki is your Bible.
Anki is essentially sort of the Anki decks, the material on the backs of the cards.
Yeah.
That I learn in a somewhat religious way.
Okay.
Whereas kind of these offhand notes, which I make, really kind of have no real importance to me.
Okay.
Unless I put it into Anki and make an active decision to learn it, I may as well never have written it down.
So you treat Anki as an extension of your brain. Like
Absolutely.
If something is an Anki, it will be uploaded to your brain at some point.
Absolutely.
And so are all of your notes from medical school in Anki? Do you use pre-made decks? How do you use Anki?
So in clinical,
Yeah.
as I said, in preclinical, my way of studying was orientated towards learning information incredibly quickly for the exams. In clinical, because I actually want to remember this
you actually want to
beyond
know this stuff.
just the exams, I use Anki because it facilitates long-term retention.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, Anki is an extension of my brain. Now, the thing with clinical medicine is that it's a somewhat universal discipline, and it's not that sort of what we're taught at Cambridge is going to be radically different to anywhere else.
Yeah.
Whereas the specific undergrad curriculum that we have at Cambridge is quite specific to Cambridge.
Yeah, quite.
And what that means is that you can use decks that other people have made. And so, for example, for the USMLE Step 1, there are amazing decks out there. There's a deck on pathoma for pathology, which I found really useful.
Yeah.
My housemate, he made a deck based on PassMed, which I found incredibly useful in the run-up to sort of the exams for learning the clinically oriented material that wasn't in the USMLE.
Yeah.
Other than that, there are some decks which I have made myself,
Okay.
so which have been specific to particular exams. So for ethics, for ethics and law, I didn't make a deck. One of my friends, Satnam, he made a deck and really kindly shared it with me, and that was pretty much all I used for the exam. But separately for the SBA exam, I made another deck, which was based on Oxford Assess and Progress.
Yeah.
Now, I never actually had time to go through that deck before the exam, but the information in that deck is something which I do intend to learn for my clinical practice.
Okay, so if it goes in Anki, you have decreed it legit information enough to be uploaded to your brain.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
interesting. Because it seems like in the US, it seems like the majority med school USMLE strategy is based around Anki.
Yeah.
It just makes sense because it's the perfect thing geared up to this stuff. And like your Microsoft Word document active recall framework, my Google Sheets spaced repetition method, and all this stuff, these are all hacks for when you have to cram for an exam.
Exactly.
That's like 2 months away, or if not less time away. Whereas Anki, it's like
I mean,
you've got the luxury of time.
There are ways of using Anki.
Yeah.
Kind of not really how it was intended, but to achieve that same objective.
The cramming.
Where you essentially cram information on Anki. I found that if you do a deck twice, if you get cards right twice, that's often enough for an exam that you have, which is just around the corner. And the reason I say that is the first time when you're learning the information, it's not synthesized with the rest of the information. So you'll learn individual facts, but they won't come together in your mind. It's the second time you go through the information that you'll link cards to other cards.
Like in your mind.
In your mind, conceptually.
So you think it's okay the first time around? Because one of the issues that I have with Anki personally, and that I know a lot of people struggle with, is that it becomes very easy to lose the forest from the trees. How do you kind of deal with that? Or do you just sort of accept that, first time around, I'm just going to know these in isolation and I'll build up the model over time?
Well, no. As I said, I can't bring myself to learn a card unless I kind of understand what's going on. So I would never just really memorize a card, except in very rare sort of exceptional situations. There would usually be some kind of logic for why the structure is as it is, or the answer is what it is. Having said that, even if you can understand a card in isolation, it doesn't mean that necessarily you can synthesize all the cards in a coherent framework in your mind at that point. That's what the second run through facilitates. I mean, and honestly, even the third run through, it's like watching a sort of a complex film many times. You know, sort of each time you watch it, you realize more, you understand a bit more.
Have you seen Dunkirk?
I've seen it once.
I've seen it once, and the first time I did not realize the 3 storylines were happening. I just did not realize that.
Right.
And I treated them as if it were just one continuous thing. I was like, okay, this is the right film. But I know that if I were to watch it a second time with that knowledge, suddenly a lot more things would make sense.
Absolutely. As in having kind of that kind of sort of foundation laid where you kind of have the ability to recall other cards, even if you can't do it in a very crisp way.
Yeah.
Means you can start linking information together and synthesizing the cards together into a more coherent picture in your mind. And that's why actually in some ways Anki allows you to memorize in order to understand.
Yeah, I've always felt a bit uneasy with that sort of concept. The way that I would like to be able to approach things is to sort of start off with a broad brushstroke. These are the 30 topics within cardiology, and here's how they relate to one another.
Yeah.
And now I'll use Anki to blitz memorize the salient points about each of them.
I would say understanding is an iterative process. And understanding is prior to memorization.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
Yeah.
So I'll understand each card and then memorize it.
Yeah.
But when I do the cards in the second time, there might be a bit of a tension between one card that I'm currently doing and another card which I have in my memory. There might be a bit of a conflict in the information there. And in order to try and resolve that, in order to harmonize the two, that process will increase my level of understanding. And Anki facilitates that because it lets you essentially memorize everything. And you shouldn't expect to have that really kind of high level synthetic level of understanding at that stage, because you haven't kind of filled in you haven't really battle tested your understanding by sort of testing that everything is coherent. And by kind of bringing up these pieces of information, Anki is really testing you. Is your knowledge coherent? Is your understanding coherent?
So the image that sort of comes to mind is sort of like a kind of 64-bit pixel drawing of something, whereby kind of the Anki card, like each Anki card is an individual pixel. And over time, as you learn more and more pixels, you start to see the bigger picture. And then only when you really step back,
absolutely,
once you've got all the pixels in place, you say, oh, I now see the bigger picture.
Except you're also sort of forgetting pixels as you kind of learn them.
You know, the forgetting curve and all that stuff, space repetition, all that stuff. A lot of people say that there's a lot of value in making your own flashcards. I wonder what you think about that, because I probably don't agree with that advice.
I mean, I don't have any evidence either for or against. The advantage of making your own flashcards is that you will most likely understand them, unless you've copied and pasted them. Usually when I use decks made by other people, I have to spend a little while on each card making sure that I actually understand the card.
Yeah.
I would still say that the net time taken is significantly less than were I to actually try and make the deck myself. But it's definitely easier to learn a deck the first time that I've already made than, say, a deck that I've got from someone else.
So if you were to go through medical school again, kind of from day one, you would say Anki all the way, basically. There was a dude who came second in my year in like literally all of the subjects who was Anki from day one, and that was his Bible.
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, I didn't particularly like using Anki back in first or second year, just because it took a lot more time than just writing out questions where the answers were in the notes. And because it forces you to review things, the rate at which you can progress and learn new information is substantially lower.
Because you've got these I've got 80 cards to review before I get to new material.
Absolutely. And I think to a certain degree, in the first 2 years, the knowledge that you're learning isn't necessarily something that you want to keep forever.
Yeah.
And a lot of it you will forget. Whereas in clinical medicine, to a much larger degree, this is something ideally you want to remember for the rest of your career. So, I think Anki is a very versatile tool, and you can use it in multiple ways. You can use it in, you can essentially do this question method on Anki. You can just kind of write the questions on the front of the card, and
just not have an answer for that.
and just learn it like that. It's essentially exactly the same thing. Or you can do a more comprehensive way where you write out all the answers and then actually do the reviews. And I think, again, it depends what you want out of it. Whether you want to kind of cram to like learn some information that you probably for the exam which you won't really need in the future, whether this is something which ideally you want to know for life.
And so I've read quite a few bits on the internet about how to use Anki properly. And some people say that, well, each flashcard should only have one fact on it. Or you should only be tested on one fact per flashcard. And yet for me, when I was in my third year, I was sort of using Anki to memorize entire paragraphs or essays and things, which is probably not the intended use for Anki, and certainly doesn't go into this one fact per flashcard. How do you approach this? Like, how big are your flashcards?
Yeah, for me, it's not one fact per flashcard, but it's one concept per flashcard.
Okay.
And a concept can be like deep.
Right.
And it can have multiple things in it. For example, one treatment protocol, I would consider as one concept. I think there's a risk where if you only learn one fact at a time, it's very difficult to actually resynthesize the information on the spot.
Yeah.
And you'll have a lot of disconnected information at the time in your mind, which it's hard to really recruit and recall.
So for example, for you, would atrial fibrillation be a single flashcard?
For instance, atrial fibrillation, maybe in a particular context, such as how you would manage paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, might be a particular flashcard with the first, second line, third line.
But you wouldn't have separate flashcards for first line for paroxysmal AF, second line,
I would steer clear of doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you're kind of fragmenting the concept. There should be some kind of reason in your mind why something is prioritized over another, and if you kind of split them up between cards, I think you lose that kind of bigger picture understanding.
Yeah, so I think like what we're saying then is that overall Anki is a great tool for essentially hacking our memory because of the active recall and the spaced repetition, which, as we both know, are the most efficient study techniques. And yet there is this tension there that actually overall throughout, like, you want to build up this mental model of the subject, you want this thread of understanding to run through everything. And there is a danger that if you just kind of rote memorize with flashcards, which you can do quite easily with Anki, that you will miss the forest.
Absolutely.
And it's about, I suppose it's about keeping that in the back of our minds and thinking and being aware when we are in memorization mode and being like, okay, I'm just memorizing stuff. But really, if someone asked me, to explain liver cirrhosis, I probably wouldn't be able to, because all I have is these isolated, well, I can tell you what gene, contributes to it. I can tell you what alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency is, but I really don't know what liver cirrhosis is,
Exactly.
Awesome. Do you have any other tips for Anki flashcards while we're on that topic? Just because I know you're a big proponent of it.
I would say it is probably worth playing around with some of the settings on Anki. There's a particular website which I can't recall at this point.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I'll put the link in the video description or wherever people are watching this.
Yeah, but I think what's probably most useful, at least from my perspective, is changing the actual intervals with which you test yourself. And I think the standard Anki intervals are 1 and 15. So if you get it right, it'll ask you again 15 minutes later. If you get it wrong, it'll ask you 1 minute later. Then if you get it right, then 15 minutes later. So my intervals, you know what, let me check, what are they? So this is my deck setup.
Okay, right. What does all this mean?
So basically,
talk me through your settings.
So I do not have a 1 minute interval.
Okay.
Which means if I get things wrong, it will ask me 15 minutes later.
15? Ooh.
Which means I have to retain information for quite a long time before it counts as memorized. And on top of that, on the converse, it actually facilitates quick learning.
Yeah, I hate the 1 minute interval.
Because
it keeps on repeating stuff.
So by contrast, if you know something, the next time it'll show it to you is 1.5 days later. So that's the next interval, 2,160 minutes.
Okay.
The third interval, 10,080, is 7 days later, and the fourth interval is 28 days later.
Wow, okay.
And what this means is it's basically only when you can remember something after 28 days that it really counts it as you having learnt it.
Yeah. As
opposed to when in the typical setup where after sort of you getting it right after 15 minutes, it considers that you've learnt it.
Yeah.
And then it goes into its own review calculation, which when it calculates how long to space between reviews, it has its own calculation algorithm, which can basically create problems where if you start getting things wrong multiple times, then it's very difficult to increase the interval back up again, and so you'll keep being tested on a card again and again when you don't necessarily need to be tested on it.
That's what I used to find frustrating about the default Anki settings. But
Whereas this makes sure that doesn't happen, because in order for a card to graduate to that review stage, you have to remember it after 28 days, which already indicates a very high level of retention.
Okay, what about the other options on here? Do you have anything else?
So the other ones aren't really too significant, to be honest.
So max reviews per day, 1,000.
I mean, again, that's something you can just change.
So do you do 1,000 reviews a day, or do you just kind of do however many?
No, however many. Sort of, I feel like I've just put max reviews at 1,000, so that if there are whatever they are, it does show me, because I don't typically have more than that. But yeah, no. So I'd say that the main benefit of this is that it facilitates a deeper learning, because you have to recall for 15 minutes, and also if you do already know things, you can get through a deck faster, because you don't have to do things twice on the same day. You only have to do it once.
Yeah.
You only have to get it right once on the first day, as opposed to twice. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And can you talk us through just what your decks look like at the moment?
So, if I go back to the decks. So this at the top is the Ethics and Law deck, which Satnam made and he gave for me based on kind of the lecture notes for that. And that's something which I basically crammed before the exam. This is my step 1 master deck here, which has all of the information from the USMLE step 1, which is the Zanki deck, plus a few. I mean, I've edited the cards myself. Now there are a few different subdecks here, because sometimes there are certain topics that I want to focus on.
And is that subdecks that you've created?
Yeah. So for instance, sounds has cardiac sounds and respiratory sounds in it. To train,
as in like actual...
Yeah, actual kind of like auscultation
Right.
noises, to train me to recognize those.
Okay, and you've done that because they were in the master deck, and then you've just filtered them by tags or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then right now sounds has some other stuff in it as well, but that's initially what it was for.
Okay.
Subject 2 I think has neuro in it. Subject 3 I think has psychiatry in it. Subject 4 has cardio and renal. At this point I can't remember what I put in subject 5 and 6.
And you find it handy to split this up into subdecks, I guess, because
it lets me study one thing at a time.
Yeah, and that makes sense, rather than getting a random fact from renal and then a random fact from neurology.
And absolutely, but when I've learned them, I'll move them back into the master deck.
When you've learned them.
So in the sense that I'll put them in the subdeck so that I can learn them quickly without sort of
getting derailed by other subjects.
Exactly.
Okay, so if you're thinking today's going to be my renal day,
exactly,
you're just blitzing through.
I'll put the renal cards in another deck, do the renal cards, and then I can go back to my main deck and do the reviews for the day.
Okay.
Without having to finish all the renal cards necessarily.
Got it.
But then when I have learnt renal, I'll move it back into the main deck.
Okay. And how often do you review? Do you just kind of review this as and when you feel like it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I say, I haven't really done this since May, but before that, I was doing it quite regularly.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Then this is Doc's Internal Medicine deck, and another deck from Reddit.
Yeah.
This isn't something I've really used that much. Okay. I'm not sure whether I will use it. Duke's Pathoma deck is the deck that I used in the run-up to our kind of SBA exams in 5th year. And because there were quite a few subjects I had done with Zanki, but there were a lot of other ones which I hadn't done. About half of the topics within medicine I hadn't covered. Just a few weeks
time,
sort of,
just because you hadn't got around to it.
Exactly. And it's too with Zanki, again, you have that kind of structure where each card has one piece of information usually.
Yeah.
Whereas Duke's deck relatively has a lot more information on each card, which isn't great for long-term retention so much, but it means you can learn it a lot faster.
If you're cramming for an exam.
If you're cramming, exactly.
Right.
So
when going back to Zanki, is that based on Pathoma?
Zanki is based on Pathoma and USMLE first aid, and first aid for step 1.
And so is it that you download the deck and then you just start going from it, or how is there some level of you hide all the cards and apart from the subject?
I'll suspend all the cards,
Okay.
and then unsuspend the ones that I want to study. But the ones after I've learned them and I'm reviewing them, I won't resuspend them. I'll sort of keep going through the reviews, and that's why I use decks to separate subjects within unsuspended cards.
Within unsuspended cards. Okay, so within this step 1 master deck, you've probably still got loads of suspended cards that you haven't yet covered.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then, let's say one day you decide, you know what, I'm going to do all of cardiology today.
Yeah.
You would unsuspend all of the cardiology cards.
I'll unsuspend cardiology, I'll do cardiology. Now, say I want to do renal, I'll unsuspend renal. But cardiology is also unsuspended, so I'll move renal into another deck to separate them.
And so while you're learning renal itself on the day, it's in a separate deck, so you can just bash
Absolutely,
renal.
focus on that.
But then later on,
I'll move renal back into the main deck.
Now you're reviewing renal and cardiology, which are subjects you're not familiar with.
And now I'll move maybe psychiatry into another deck.
And I suppose that helps solve this conundrum of, if you took all of medicine and just started randomly learning these 10,000 Anki cards, you would not understand a thing.
Absolutely.
But with this method, you can take one subject at a time, and in a way, you can sort of have an active subject that you're sort of actively bashing through just that subject. And then you've got this bank of reviews of stuff that you've already done.
Absolutely.
That's a really good way of doing it.
And I mean, even within that, even within renal, I'll do the physiology and anatomy first.
Yeah.
And then do the pathology, again, to make sure I've understood what's going on before I learn what's going wrong.
And so for example, the Zanki deck is all split up. It's tagged appropriately.
It's tagged, yeah, according to that kind of division.
And you can just kind of run a query on Anki to say, find me.
Well, you don't even need to run a query. You just use a tag browser.
Oh,
so you
can just click on renal plus anatomy, and then you'll get all the cards that are tagged with renal and anatomy.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, what about for decks that your friends made? So can we have a look at this one? Mm-hmm. And so if we browse through this deck, what do these cards just generally look like?
So this is Satnam's deck again, which is based on ethics and law. This is kind of.
So let's just go through this. Right, 8 principles of confidentiality. Wow. Oh, okay, so loads of information per flashcard, but actually
this is information dense, but it's kind of geared towards learning very quickly for the exam.
Okay, so this isn't information necessarily you'd want to retain absolutely forever.
Well, no. I mean, certainly I've forgotten this pretty quickly.
Yeah.
If we go back, if we go to browse, and I'm just trying to see.
Safety.
I mean, so again, you've got sort of
describe our book versus GMC 2005
case description here.
Yeah.
And
so this is sort of how I was using Anki in my third year, where I'd have on, for example, Badley and H 1972 memory experiment, and then I'd sort of have what experiment they did and what the results of it were. And
absolutely, yeah.
So it seems like we can use Anki just basically as a second brain of sorts for stuff like medicine, with the caveat that actually for conceptual things, perhaps. I mean, Anki is also good for conceptual things. It's just that
it is. I mean, I can show you sort of one of the cards I have. Let's see. It might be in here.
Yeah, because in my kind of second and third year, when I was using Anki properly, it was an extension of my brain. It was as if, like, the instant I added something to my Anki, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that would be uploaded to my brain, just by virtue of the fact that I was going through Anki for several hours each day. And that was such a nice place to be, because it just simplified everything.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what you want to sort of really do. So this is an example of a very, very information-rich card, but it's actually just entirely one concept.
What's the closed ATPase pump in the luminal membrane of the G-intercalated cells that stimulates aldosterone? What is the purpose? Other effects?
So, I mean, basically, this is considering the role that aldosterone plays in generating a contraction alkalosis with the paradoxical aciduria. And it's relatively complex. I mean, there are 3 ways, but even within those ways, there are kind of categories.
So you'd be spending a long time going over this.
So in the sense that I would spend a long time on this card, but in reality, it's all one concept.
Yeah, and that one concept, like loads, like that whole explanation follows from one concept. And once you've
Absolutely.
understood that,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
all
yeah.
makes sense rather than it being distinctive facts that you have to memorize each time.
Exactly.
Interesting. And is this a Zanki card or what?
This
one that you
was
made
a
yourself?
Zanki card, which I've edited.
Okay, so you're comfortable with just adding stuff to
Yeah,
flashcards to
absolutely.
flesh them out and add, because you don't, as you said, you want to be able to understand stuff.
Yeah.
So if you see something in Zanki, in a pre-made Anki deck that you don't understand, you just Google it, blah blah blah, and then you add the information to the card.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, in order to understand this one, I feel like I spent 6 hours just Googling until I found the answer. But after that, I felt like the whole of renal medicine just kind of opened up to me.
Interesting. I'll have to check these cards out.
It was the key in many ways.
Fantastic. You're heavy on the pre-made decks. You're heavy on understanding before memorizing.
Yeah.
And even though you can sort of use Anki to, in a way, memorize before you understand, like alongside as you're doing a card, you don't just take things at face value.
No.
If something doesn't make sense, you will spend the time Googling it.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't think you're wasting your time because actually you've got efficiency savings in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that kind of sort of research in order to understand why a card is the way it is, for me, is in some ways irresistible, as I was saying before. So I could spend hours really trying to understand a particular card, and I wouldn't really, and for me that would be kind of interesting. So I wouldn't really consider it a waste of time.
All right. Well, you've inspired me to get out a Pathoma subscription tonight and get the Zanki deck.
So yeah, this is the discussion between me and Asaid about how to use flashcards, specifically Anki, properly and how to think about it. So I hope you enjoy it.